In previous lessons, we learned that a critical transition happened on Earth some 4 billion years ago. The first living cells emerged, and they went on to reproduce and evolve over time to form all the living species today. At least that's the modern biological view of what happened. We also learned that cells are the smallest things on Earth that have all of the characteristics on this list. You must have all of these characteristics to be alive, and cells have all of these characteristics. To understand the origin of life on Earth, then, it's helpful to understand what is the simplest kind of cell that we know of. And so we will use bacteria as our example cell. If we can get to the bottom of how bacteria are structured, then we'll be able to take a stab at how those living cells emerged on Earth. So bacteria are a diverse group. There are many different kinds of bacteria that live in all kinds of different places on Earth, including extreme environments. Here's a scanning electron microscope picture of a bacteria. So this is highly magnified. They are rod-like cells, these ones here. But not all bacteria are rod-like. Some are spheres and have different shapes. Here we see one cell is in the process of dividing, and this is how bacteria cells reproduce. A single bacteria cell is called a bacterium, so technically bacteria is plural. Now we'll see the bacteria cells, being the simplest cells, they do share characteristics with all other cells on Earth. For example, all cells have a boundary called the plasma membrane, and this sort of keeps all the contents of the cell together. All cells have fluid inside called cytoplasm, where the chemistry of life happens. All cells have DNA, the hereditary molecule for life on Earth. But some cells also have a cell wall outside of the cell membrane. And some cells have a capsule, but we'll be focusing sort of on the general features that all cells have, and we'll use bacteria as our example. Cells are made of molecules, which of course are made of atoms. In this diagram, we can see the molecular components of a living bacteria cell. It's about 70% water. That's the cytoplasm. And then 30% other chemicals, other kinds of molecules. And in that 30%, we can break that down into different categories of molecules. So 15% proteins, 4% small molecules, 6% RNA, that's sort of a cousin to DNA. Phospholipids will make up the membrane of the cell, and then polysaccharides and sugars and things. So most of life, then, is water. Water is a major component of cells, and that's because life is chemistry, and the chemistry that occurs to keep a cell alive is happening in water. Water is good at dissolving chemicals and allowing them to interact in specific ways that helps the cell stay alive. You'll recall that water molecules were formed in space as hydrogen and oxygen chemically reacted. The water in the cloud of gas and dust that formed our solar system became the Earth's oceans. Earth was in the habitable zone, so water could exist as a liquid. Liquid water is the fluid in which the chemistry of life occurs, and so life on Earth needs water. And scientists would be interested to learn whether life could occur in any other kind of fluid medium, but we know life requires water here on Earth. So again, we drew this in our blue books. We have giant clouds of gas and dust, and that's the stuff out of which solar systems are made. The water on Earth was previously in these clouds of dust as water molecules. So let's now break down the bacteria cell and see how molecules contribute to its structure. So cells have a boundary separating the self from the environment. The plasma membrane is that first barrier that all cells have. Some bacteria, in addition, have a cell wall and a capsule. But let's focus on the cell membrane. Cell membranes are composed of molecules called lipids. Lipid molecules are constructed from fat molecules. And the lipid bilayer forms the flexible boundary to the cell. So here in this picture we see the sort of a magnification of the cell membrane. It's two layers of these molecules called lipids. So bilayer would be two layers. they sort of look like balloons with the two strings hanging off them. Here we see a magnification of the molecule. It's got this head region we can think of, and then these two tails. And in the head, they show the atoms that are involved in the head region of the molecule. The tails are long chains of carbon atoms. So every time there's a little kink there, that's a carbon atom connected to another carbon atom in a chain. But remember, carbon atoms tend to make 4 chemical bonds. What they're not showing you here are the fact that each carbon atom also is bonded to 2 individual hydrogen atoms. So we have a hydrocarbon chain. That's what a fat molecule is. So lipids form the boundary, the membrane boundary of the cell. And they are made of these atoms, carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, in this particular structure. And the reason why the head and the tail distinction is important, because in later biology courses you'll learn that the tails, these fat tails, they do not like water. They sort of would rather get close to each other rather than be surrounded by water molecules, and that's what makes these lipid molecules assemble into this lipid bilayer. So notice then the heads are at the either surface of the lipid bilayer, and the tails are aggregated in the middle. The tails, in a sense, are trying to avoid water, but this creates a flexible boundary that can keep the contents of the cell inside. Cells also have molecules like glucose. A sugar like glucose is a source of energy for cells. And by breaking its chemical bonds, energy is released. And this energy is stored in the chemical bonds of another molecule called ATP. So again, all cells on Earth have this ATP molecule. It's an energy molecule. But we want to think of molecules like glucose as being sort of repositories of energy. Each of these chemical bonds, when broken, releases energy that the cell can harness in useful ways. Other molecules in the cell include DNA. So DNA is the hereditary molecule for all life on Earth. It carries the information to construct a cell. And if you're a multi-celled organism, then the body of that organism. And it can be duplicated prior to reproduction. Very interesting feature of this molecule. We'll learn how DNA can be duplicated later. It can also change its information content, allowing for future generations to evolve. So DNA really is the key to life on Earth. It has the information to build a cell. In addition, it can be duplicated and it can change. And so this is then the basis of how living things can pass on the instructions to build that kind of living thing. Proteins are another class of molecules in the cell. Proteins perform a variety of functions that keep the cell alive. Here we see some proteins in the cell membrane, and they may be involved in importing nutrients or getting wastes out of the cell. Other proteins, like this Pac-Man or Pac-Woman thing here, maybe it breaks some chemical bonds. It helps to do some chemistry in the cell. This protein down here, maybe it also makes a chemical bond between these two molecules, the red and the green molecule. So we've got proteins that do chemical reactions. We've got proteins that move things around the cell. They perform a wide variety of tasks. So here again we have the functions of the proteins. And so a cell, in a sense, has a team of proteins to do different jobs. And it's this cooperative effort of these large molecules, these proteins, that is carrying out the basic chemical reactions that sustain the life of the cell. Now, proteins are made of molecules called amino acids. And notice the atoms involved. We've got carbons and oxygens and hydrogens, and here's nitrogen. So we didn't see nitrogen in glucose or fats, but nitrogen is an atom in the molecule called an amino acid. And just a reminder that the origin of these heavier elements happened in stars. So when stars were fusing hydrogen and helium, and eventually helium into heavier elements, that's where carbon comes from. That's where nitrogen came from. That's where oxygen came from. So the atoms that make up the amino acids in our cells came from stars. Now, a protein is a chain molecule composed of amino acids linked together by chemical bonds. And remember, a chemical bond is when atoms share a pair of electrons. So here's one amino acid up here, and here's a chain of amino acids. And amino acids differ by this R group. And in later biology courses, you may get more familiar with these different R groups. But for us, we're just going to note that there are different kinds of amino acids, but a protein is simply a chain of these amino acids chemically linked together. And so here we can see sort of this idea of a chain molecule. And this chain molecule can fold up into some shape as well. And we'll return to that idea in a moment. So proteins are composed of 20 different kinds of amino acids. They differ by this R group, and that R group can be different assemblies of different atoms. But all living things make their proteins with the same amino acids. That's an important point. Hence, eating plant or animal protein in one's diet provides the raw materials to make human protein. So this is why eating is successful, because when animals eat other living things, they can use those proteins in the other living things, break them down into the component amino acids, and then reassemble them into human proteins. Here's another look at a protein. It's a long chain of amino acids. And the different colors here indicate the different kinds of amino acids. And there are 20 different kinds of amino acids found in proteins for all living things on Earth. Here's yet another look at this, indicating that the sequence of these amino acids is going to determine how that chain folds up, and how that chain folds up will determine the function of the protein. So this is an important point about proteins. The amino acid sequence determines the shape, and the shape determines the function or the job of the protein. So if we had two different proteins, then they are performing different jobs because they have different sequences of amino acids, which will fold up into different shapes, and the different shapes is what gives these different proteins their different jobs. So a living cell is composed of molecules with varied chemical properties. Together, the molecules give the cell all of the characteristics on the list. So you see, this diagram of a bacteria is empty. We're just saying chemistry of life. But what it is that's doing the chemistry are lots of molecules in the water that is the cytoplasm of the cell. And some of those important molecules, proteins, are doing all kinds of chemical reactions, including importing food and getting rid of waste, and all of the chemical reactions that involve getting energy and building things the cell needs, etc. In fact, if we fill in some of the details, we're going to see a bacteria cell looks more like this. It's got lots of different proteins doing different jobs, and we will be examining in more detail what all is going on inside this bacteria cell. But for now, then, we have a lifeless rock turning into a rock with life, with simple bacteria cell as the key transitional moment. But as it turns out, these bacteria cells are not so simple, and we have to get a handle on what it is that's going on inside these cells that gives these cells the characteristic of life. A puzzling result of this inquiry will be that although a cell is alive, its molecular parts are not alive. So in other words, the origin of life involved non-living molecules assembling into a living thing. And this is sort of an interesting philosophical concept to get our heads around, that the whole cell is alive, but none of its parts is alive. So the whole cell can do all of those characteristics on the list, but none of these molecular parts satisfies the criteria for being alive.